I'm happy to be talking to you today about the Uncanny Valley in consumer robotics. So in case anyone's not familiar with the Uncanny Valley, it's this hypothesis that says basically as a robot increases in its human likeness in terms of basically how much it looks like a human, its likability increases up to the point at which the robot is like almost perfectly human, but not quite. So for example, like a humanoid robot with skin. And then its likability goes way down, and this is called the Uncanny Valley. It becomes like uncannily human, creepy, people really don't like it. And then when it's like a real human again, perfectly human, people's attitudes go back up. So that dip is the Uncanny Valley. So we wanted to explore this in the context of consumer robots. So these are 4 robots we used in our studies, varying in their human likeness. The 2 on top are being sold already to consumers as sort of personal assistant style robots. Pepper is being used in retail contexts, and Nadine is kind of an extremely realistic humanoid robot. There's only one of her. She's in Singapore. She's used as like a receptionist sometimes. She goes to museums other times. So in our first study, we basically just showed people one of these 4 robots and asked them a bunch of questions about how they perceive them. So the first measure was Uncanny Ness, basically asking questions like how creepy does this robot seem, how uncomfortable would you be interacting with this robot? And as predicted by the Uncanny Valley hypothesis, Nadine, the humanoid robot, is by far the creepiest. We asked how interested would you be in buying this robot? Interest in Nadine is by far the lowest. And then we asked, like, how comfortable would you be relying on this robot for a variety of tasks, like receptionist, retail salesperson? And again, comfort relying on Nadine is quite low. So we were interested in whether this pattern replicates in a culture that's much more familiar with robots, namely Japan, where robots are sort of much more common already in retail contexts and in the culture in general. So we basically just replicated this experiment with a sample of US consumers and a sample of Japanese consumers, people who are born and raised and live in Japan. And interestingly, we don't see these effects at all. So whereas in the US, Nadine is by far the creepiest, the most uncanny robot, for Japanese consumers, there was no effect. These bars are not significantly different from each other. And similarly, interest in buying among American consumers, by far the lowest interest in buying something like Nadine, whereas in Japan, that effect was not significant. And interestingly, whereas in the United States, uncanniness had a negative effect on consumers' comfort with the robots, the negative coefficient there, negative 0.3. In Japan, uncanniness actually had a positive coefficient. So the more sort of creepy and weird the robot seemed, the more comfortable Japanese consumers seemed with it. Weird effect. We don't know what's going on there yet, but we're looking into it. Quickly, one other thing we did is to look at the effect of a robot that has emotion, because this is another way in which a robot can be more human. So some of these robots, like Nadine and Pepper, have something like an emotion engine built into it that allows them to understand and detect human emotion and respond appropriately. So we showed people a video of Nadine or another robot in which the robots had their emotion engine turned on. So it was obvious that they were picking up on the human's emotions that they were interacting with and responding in more emotional ways. And we explained what this sort of emotion engine allowed the robots to do. And interestingly, this had no effect on how uncanny the robots seemed, had no effect on how much people reported liking the robots, and it had no effect on consumers' interest in buying these robots. So this is a pretty big sample. We're confident in these null results. We thought that this kind of emotional ability would increase uncanniness and decrease comfort, but no effects there. So that's interesting too. Quick word on ongoing research. We're looking at sort of consumers' responses at the end of the Uncanny Valley. So if you could have a perfectly human robot, which is probably on the way pretty quickly, does likability go back up? Does consumers' comfort with the robot go back up, or is it still super creepy? We're looking into the sources of these cultural differences, looking at whether they're due to something like just, is it familiarity with robots in general, or possibly is it related to differences in how cultures are likely to anthropomorphize objects and robots? And then a couple other projects I'll just mention quickly are looking at doing a thematic analysis of movies about robots to identify research questions and hypotheses, looking at movies like Her, Ex Machina, 2001. And then finally, looking at how does interacting with a robot versus a human in a retail context change consumers' experience. And in that study, we're doing a field study with the Pepper robot. So happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, is the creepy robot Nadine less creepy potentially to the Japanese participants because of its ethnicity?
Yeah, that's an interesting hypothesis.
Caucasian robot?
So you think if something's the same ethnicity as you, if the
It's
robot's
even creepier.
It's even creepier. Yeah, that's definitely possible. we'll explore that in our future studies.
How do you think ratings of creepiness or uncanniness correlate with attributions of mind? Would Pepper be rated as more mindful than Nadine?
It's a good question. The only sort of paper I know empirically looking at the Uncanny Valley is a paper by Kirk Gray and Dan Wegner, and they find that uncanniness correlates with perception of experience, which is one of the two sort of dimensions of mind perception. So I would think that the more mind a robot has, the more uncanny it would seem. Not sure, haven't looked at that yet either, but interesting question. I mean, what would you predict?
No idea, that's
Okay.
why I asked.